And now it's time for the pundits. Joining us today is Kevin Richert of Idaho Ed News, Keith Riddler of the Associated Press, and Betsy Russell of the Idaho Press. I almost said Spokesman Review. I have not done this quite as much as Melissa has lately. So guys, what a week. The House floor was filled with fireworks today, Friday, but it started earlier in this week. How did we get here, Betsy?
Well, first, of course, the Senate, by just one vote, passed Senate Bill 1159 to very, very sharply restrict voter initiatives and referenda in Idaho.
This was after a couple of very contentious hearings as well.
I mean, pretty much all the testimony was against it from a wide variety of people, you know, retired judges, professors, people who volunteered on the Medicaid expansion initiative, ordinary citizens, healthcare advocates, all kinds of people. There were just a handful of people who supported it. Most of them were paid lobbyists. Nevertheless, it passed by one vote, came over to the House. House was getting ready to pass it. Word was that's what they were going to do yesterday, but they didn't. And instead, everything stalled as more and more opposition kept coming out. 4 former Idaho attorneys general issued a letter saying they believe the bill's unconstitutional or would be found so by a court. Former Idaho Secretary of State, longtime Idaho Secretary of State Ben Asursa, said it was a full frontal assault on the constitutional right to the initiative, and that if the legislature wants to change that, they need to change the Constitution.
It seems like the legislature was just stopped dead in its tracks at that point. The House floor was just people mulling around.
Basically, I mean, both parties went into caucus, and then the Republicans just kind of stayed there for hours, and they didn't ever seem to emerge with anything, and the House never went back on the floor. And finally, there were a whole lot of hungry people milling around, and it was well into the lunch hour. And so House Majority Leader Mike Moyle announced, we don't, you know, since they didn't even have a quorum there to recess, everybody just go to lunch. We're going to start again at 2:30. We'll deal with it then.
But surprise.
But surprise. So some of us went to lunch. I never go to lunch during the legislature, but I did. And I came back and saw your tweet, Seth, that just 2 minutes before that, the House Ways and Means Committee had voted to introduce a new initiatives bill.
And I found out about that about 5 minutes before that.
Yeah, it was quite the surprise. The meeting was so little noticed that even a member of the committee, Representative Elaine Smith, never heard about it till afterwards. She did not attend. She was down the hall at another meeting at which First Lady Teresa Little was speaking in honor of a women's event. It was an unusual series of events, to say the least. And this new bill that was introduced is cast as a, quote, trailer bill. And when we normally hear about trailer bills in the legislature, it's for bills that are passed that have a fiscal impact. JFAC comes back and passes a funding bill that trails after the other bill and provides the funding after the fact. This is basically an amendment in the form of another bill. And the idea is that the House now has passed 1159 and sent it to the governor. They've passed this new trailer bill that would slightly relax a couple of the provisions, and they've sent that to the Senate.
And Keith, you ran us through today in your article of like what this all means, how this process worked, what the steps are going through it.
I interviewed House Speaker Scott Bedke after the votes, and I asked him, how does this work now? He said that 1159 now goes straight to the governor, and that the other one, the trailer bill, goes over to the Senate for them to vote on. If the Senate approves, that bill then goes to the governor. The governor would sign both bills, and the trailer bill language, you know, slightly softening the requirements, would replace the language in 1159. That's the plan.
So if the governor doesn't ever get this other bill, he's just stuck with one option.
Things could go wrong.
Nothing's ever gone wrong at the Idaho legislature. What are you talking about?
That's the plan at the moment. We'll see what happens.
So, Kevin, you were watching today.
Yes.
Let's take a step back from what the bill actually does to, I mean, we saw an amazing debate on the floor of the House.
I thought it was some of the most compelling debate that I've heard on the House floor in years. And it befits an issue this important, this fundamental a change in how the initiative process would work. You had serious questions raised about the constitutionality, which has been raised already. You had lawmakers on both sides of the political spectrum raising serious questions about context and history and the relationship of the people in this process and the legislature. You had Matt Erpelding talking about the origins of this initiative,
You also had
clause
Matt
of the
Erpelding
Constitution.
yelling at the speaker for
Yes,
all intents and
yes,
purposes.
that's where we had some of the fireworks. But you had Representative Erpelding talking about this. This goes back to 1912. This goes back to a time when there was widespread concern about corruption. It came about the same time of the 17th Amendment regarding the direct election of U.S. senators, and then contrasting that with Representative Heather Scott, a very conservative lawmaker from North Idaho, who I thought had very powerful debate talking about the relationship between the people and direct democracy as embodied by the initiative process and indirect democracy as embodied by the normal legislative process, and the tension we see quite often when an initiative does pass. And this isn't just this year with Medicaid expansion. It's 1978 or 79 with the 1% initiative. It's the term limits initiatives that we saw passed years ago. There's this constant push and pull, this power struggle between the people and direct democracy and the legislature and indirect democracy and the implementation of initiatives. I thought Scott's debate was fascinating. I mean, as a student of political science, this was fascinating debate and a lot of grist that Governor Little is going to have to address one way or the other when he weighs in on this, whether he signs it or vetoes it.
And you talked to the governor today.
No, I didn't. I
Oh.
tried to. I sent him a message. He didn't respond in a substantive way. But to
He was
get
like,
back
new
to,
phone, who dis?
To get back to Scott's, her speech on the floor, she also touched on the kind of the urban-rural divide and
Right.
the changing demographics in Idaho. A lot of people moving here, mostly to urban areas, they tend to be more, Democratic, vote liberal, less so than the rural areas, and that's kind of what's driving both 1159, which obviously the lawmakers started thinking they got pushback from their constituents, so they had to soften it up a little bit, not much. When Republican Representative Scott Syme left the floor today, he told me one voter told him he'd never vote for Syme again, and Syme voted for both those bills today. There's just a lot of anger out there. You sense it in the committee hearings also. It was palpable sometimes.
And those demographics, I mean, that's kind of the elephant in the room here, is what sort of initiative might come down the pike that would be affected by a change in the rules, and you can assert your cause. Any number of causes that the legislature has not addressed in the past few years, whether it's marijuana, whether it's minimum wage, whether it's faith healing, whether it's add the words, whether it's pre-K, on down the list. What are the rules for an initiative down the road on those issues or others? I mean, the demographics, it's inescapable. It's a huge part of this debate.
And we've got these huge pieces of ideology going into this that date back to the beginning of our country. We've got these boogeymen that are out there, like marijuana, minimum wage for some folks. Are people trying to find ideology that matches how they want to vote, or a boogeyman that matches how they want to vote? Or does it feel like everyone's actually coming at this from a upright, honest manner, and just that's why we're getting these heated discussions
It
here?
was interesting in the debate today that there was so much more debate against the bill than there was in favor of it. There were not really that many clear rationales articulated for this bill, other than, well, we want to broaden the participation of ordinary citizens in what gets placed on the ballot. But there were some holes in that argument that were poked quite easily by those who were arguing against it. I sense that behind that was, we mentioned demographics here, this fear that Idaho is undergoing a shift to become more of an urban state. And when we have our next redistricting, the rural voice in the Idaho legislature will be lost. Well, traditionally, the Idaho legislature was dominated by farmers. They were the only ones who could take the winter off and be sitting in Boise. That's not really the case anymore, but there's still quite a lot of farmers in the Idaho legislature, and agriculture is a very powerful force in our state, even as it's declined relative to other sectors of our economy. And it was the agriculture groups that were most strongly behind this initiative, the Farm Bureau and the food producers.
And as we turn our focus towards the governor and what he winds up doing, I think it's important not just to look at the vote margins that we saw in both houses, but some of the opposition that you saw emerge. I mean, the obvious, neither house cleared the 2/3 that you would need to override a veto. So it'd be almost unthinkable that the numbers would be there for a veto override. But what I was struck by when I looked at the numbers today on the House vote, on 1159, not the trailer bill, it wasn't just the Democrats who voted no, and it wasn't just the Democrats and a few arch conservatives like Heather Scott and Priscilla Giddings. You had the chair of the Health and Welfare Committee, the chair of the Education Committee, the chair of the Resources Committee, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee. Powerful committees. I mean, these are lieutenants of House Speaker Scott Bedke, all voted no. And it sort of raises questions about the news release that the Republican caucus sent out a few days earlier indicating caucus support for 1159. Obviously they had the votes, but they didn't have
Yeah.
lockstep support from some very powerful folks within that caucus.
It was only 40 to 30. I mean,
Right.
that was not a party line vote by any stretch in the House. I did speak with the House Ways and Means Chairman, Representative Anders, afterwards, and he voted against 1159, but in favor of the trailer bill. And his reason? He doesn't think 1159 is defensible in court. And that was a big point in the debate today. Particularly, we heard from Representative Ilana Rubel giving a legal analysis of why she said that she's been sleeping easy at night because she feels quite comfortable that no court will uphold this law. And many of us reporters have asked Speaker Bedke about this in recent days, and he said, oh, that's always a risk. Whenever we pass a bill, we might have to go to court. But it's concerning if we are passing something that's unconstitutional. We also heard, you know, from some of the legislators, maybe even more on the right, a really deep concern about the Constitution, and do we have respect for the Constitution? And if so, why would we pass something that infringes on it?
How important was it to get this done Friday and not let everyone go home and not hear from their constituents? Did that come into this rush to a decision?
Probably. It might have been a closer vote if lawmakers had heard from more of their constituents when they got home. It's possibly had something to do with that.
People are really fired up about this because we're just coming off the successful Medicaid expansion initiative, which really was unprecedented in the way that it mobilized volunteers and people from all different political stripes and walks of life. And those people are all still out there going, what? You're kicking us in the face for doing our civic duty, for standing up for what we thought was the right thing to do.
And I think folks on both sides of this debate would agree that if these kind of changes go into effect, the initiative process in the state is fundamentally different. It's much more pay to play, and it's much less grassroots. I don't think there's any way you can get around that.
And this sets the stage. We've already got an initiative about initiatives that's coming up. We've got the governor who's going to probably have to make one of the biggest decisions of his short but tenure at this point. What happens next? I mean, if the governor signs this into law, how do we move forward?
Well, I think that if the governor does sign 1159 into law, whether or not the trailer bill follows it, I think the state will land in court. I think that they will be sued. I think we'll be covering this for the next year as far as the court fights and what comes out of it. It may be upheld, it may not. From what we've been hearing, most likely not.
And if he vetoes it?
If he vetoes it, I think he's making a very strong statement. I think that it'll make a big splash. I think he's setting the terms of his relationship with the legislature and defining what his role is in this process, which he hasn't really had the opportunity to do yet. Most of his proposals have gone through pretty easily thus far.
Well, it looks like we got a lot to look forward to over next week. We thought we'd be out, but it seems like we got more. Betsy Russell, Keith Riddler, Kevin Richert, thank you so much for joining us.